myself. I got interested in all this stuff. I lived down in Fort Myers, went to Florida Gulf Coast University, and I went to ECHO down there, which is Ecological Concerns for Hunger Organization. And they have a pretty interesting thing going on down there. And they have, I think, 50-something acre kind of research and demonstration site growing a lot of fruit trees and vegetable crops and perennial vegetables. And they're the ones who actually introduced moringa to the U.S. and a lot of these interesting crops that everyone's growing now in Florida. So I saw that and started learning more about permaculture, reading books in the library and stuff, and then just kept getting more and more and more into it. And just kind of fell off the deep end and started growing a bunch of fruit trees. Started just rental houses where I was living, and I just started planting fruit trees there. I mean, a lot of people may not own land or anything, but you can just grow fruit trees from seed and plant them out, and you don't necessarily need to buy a lot of expensive plants. And you can, but if you learn how to graft and propagate stuff, we'll talk a little bit about that here in the beginning of the presentation. There's a place that I was renting in Fort Myers now that students are still renting it, and there's all the stuff that we planted, and one of my friends lived there afterwards and planted out a bunch of stuff, so the whole entire yard is like mostly all stuff from seed that we grew out. We're cutting just like free plants, but now there's a whole huge food forest of jackfruits and custard apples and canistels and all this kind of stuff that we're just like, that's going to take forever to fruit, we'll plant it anyway. Tamarins and all that kind of stuff. So, just because you don't have a lot of land or money doesn't mean you can't get into this. You can start very cheaply. You can grow stuff, like I said, from seed cuttings and very minimal resources necessary. But you can totally get really into it and buy, part of a rainforest in Costa Rica and plant it all with coconuts and man-made sapotes. And you can get crazy with it too. But you can start on a very small scale with just a few plants and just containers. And don't let anything really hold you back. So we're going to talk a little bit about tree crop production and fruit trees for Florida, for this part of Florida. And I'm going to kind of point out things that will grow here, and I'll mention things that'll do better further south, since mostly everyone's from further south. But I'm still going to talk about some stuff that does better in this part of Florida. And we'll see what's growing around here. So we're going to do about an hour in here and an hour outside. And feel free to ask any questions. A lot of the stuff we're talking about, we have a nursery here that we're selling it. So if you're interested in getting it now at some other time, we can pretty much track down anything in here, or we have it already in the nursery. So I'm going to talk about a few terms that I'll use in this presentation real quickly, just to kind of get introduced here. Protected locations is a term that I'll use a lot. And that's the spot that's not really exposed to full wind, that's kind of blocked from the brunt of wind and cold and exposure. So those are areas where certain fruit trees are going to do better. And you'll see when we walk around the property better examples of that. It's kind of harder to explain than to see for yourself. But once you get to know what that means and notice, like, when you have a freeze, especially if you watch like where stuff freezes and where stuff doesn't freeze, you kind of get to know like what those protected locations are. And you can just see on your property, like, this banana gets really hit by the wind and gets messed up, and the ones over here behind this building, you'll figure out where the prevailing winds are in your area, and you kind of figure out where and when, how to place stuff. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. So certain plants really don't grow well unless they're in a protected spot. And one of those is starfruit. They're actually wind intolerant. That's a great tree that a lot of people grow here. And they can do great in some wind, but if you put the starfruit where it's in no wind, they just become massive very quickly and do a lot better and yield a lot better. So for some reason that tree, there's a bunch of other species that don't like wind. And a lot of those are more tropical understory species like cacao and chocolate and things along those lines that are really in a dense forest setting naturally. So there's a lot of species like that. And a lot of these things that people are growing in the open actually do better in the understory in a more jungly setting, like jackfruit really does not prefer to be out in the open with a bunch of other jackfruits like in an orchard. They actually like to be kind of in a mixed polyculture with a lot of dense planting around it. There's more moisture, and there's something about them. They don't like growing near other jackfruits as much as other plants. They have some kind of root. They like root diversity, I guess. And that's true with a lot of species you'll see. So a big thing to consider when you're planting fruit trees is the sun position. That's something that a lot of people kind of forget about, or they don't put into enough thought about. So, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, but it changes orientation in the sky during the summertime and the wintertime. During the wintertime, the sun goes further to the south during the day, so the sun's pitched further to the south. In the summertime, it's more directly overhead, and it changes between this is almost directly south right here. So midwinter, the sun's very low, almost like coming through this window very heavily. Right now it's still up like this, but it's dropping, dropping, dropping. And in the summertime, it's directly overhead this, so we're getting baking, you know, it'd be cooking in here almost right now. Even though it's pretty insulated, it's not like that. But it still would be a lot hotter. So remembering those things really helps a lot when you're planting fruit trees. You can put a fruit tree on this side of the building, on the north side, right against it, and it's going to be like the opposite effect that you want. It's going to be blocked from the winter sun. When the cold comes, it's going to hit that plant first against the building and keep it cold constantly. Whereas if you plant trees on this side of the building, on the south side, the winter sun's warming it and warming the building and reflecting heat onto that plant. So you're going to get a lot better results with certain tropical species, especially if you're kind of pushing. Everyone mentioned where they are. We're all, if we're growing tropical species, kind of pushing it. Even in Inglewood, unless you're in like Miami or the Keys, like you're still going to have frost in Florida. So there's certain things you can grow in the open there that we protect here. But then if you wanted to push other species like soursop or other things more tropical like black sapote or things, that's where you start to work with, putting on the south side of a building or, really working with windbreaks and things like that. So even, in Georgia, you could grow bananas. You put it on the south side of a barn and, kind of protect them with windbreaks and things like that. And people have fruited surprisingly stuff way outside of the range that most folks would say you can't, just by kind of working with those laws. So also to maximize space and production, usually the shortest plants should be put in the east and the south because you don't want to block morning light on your property and you don't really want to block that wintertime light. So when you're planting your property, it should basically start the lowest in the southeast side and gradually build up in height to the northwest corner if you have that kind of space to work with. If you just have a little tiny yard, work with what you have, but paying attention to those principles of where the sun's rising and setting and how it changes throughout the year. And with a lot of these tropical species, having that wintertime sun exposure is very important because those few extra degrees make all the difference between a tree freezing out and dying or fruiting that year. So just by having it on the south side, it could be 5 degrees warmer. By having trees underneath their canopy, it can be 10 degrees warmer than having them out in the open field. So in the open field, we'll see persimmons and pears and peaches and nectarines and plums. And then under the canopy in some of these areas and near the house, we have sapodillas and mangoes and pineapples and canistels that haven't frozen yet. When out here, if they were in the open, they would die. Like we had a mango out by this pond that was fairly protected, but we knew it was risky because it was further outside of the warm bubble that we've observed. We also record, we have like a little heat gun that you use for doing air conditioning work and stuff like that. And you can just aim at different parts of the property, it gives you the heat. And we have some different digital thermometers we put out. And we measure the different areas at night on the cold nights. And you can see there's huge differences. I used to work for the Naples Botanical Gardens, and we did a study down there where we put out these data loggers, and they record the temperature every 15 seconds. And they just put them out all over the property. These little tiny things. They're pretty cool to have if you want to experiment with your property. They're only like 30 bucks a piece, and you get software to put onto your computer, and it gives you graphs and everything. It shows you the temperature variations. So on a small property, you only do like 4, but we put out like 20 of them or 30 all over the place. And on one property, our main garden was 40 acres, but it was totally about 90 acres or 80 something acres. We mainly just measured in the formal garden where we had like the real tropical stuff planted in the 40-acre garden. And within there was a 25-degree temperature difference in that garden, like 3 different parts of it. And parts that we thought would be the warmest, just by it's by the lake on the peninsula. Like we had a spot that was 27 degrees there, and then up on top of the hill where there was a children's garden, like a butterfly exhibit and stuff, because it's on the hill, it was in the 40s up there. So we've seen even in this area, there's a huge difference on some of these hilltops and low places. Like there was frost I was saying yesterday, but it was more in like the Moon Lake area, which is one of the lower areas in this region, so all the frost just settles into there. The lowest points are always going to frost harder, especially if there's a big hill and you're on the back side of that hill or on the front side, the cold just settles to the bottom of it. So
So 25 degrees at the same exact time?
Same exact time, yeah.
Is that overnight or?
That was, it was like in the same second here and here was 25 degrees difference. Because like this area was in the 20s and this area was in the 40s here.
Do you know if it was at night or during the day?
It was early morning. Pretty much with frost, when you're having these events, like the worst time was like 5 to 7 in the morning usually in the wintertime. That's the coldest period. And they always say it's darkest before dawn, and that's kind of true. The heat's dissipated the most right before dawn, so that's usually when you're going to get the coldest event. If you start having frost at midnight, then you know you're in trouble here. Like that's when you start to say, we're kind of screwed. But normally it's only for like an hour or two. So like these little principles I'm giving you these ideas can usually be warm enough to get you through that. And you can do all kinds of crazy stuff like overhead irrigation and greenhouses and that kind of stuff can work. I have some people putting out heaters and all kinds of crazy stuff, but really just planting properly, you don't want to have to worry about that. It's very stressful. And know that if you're risking, different species that are more tropical, you're going to have some stuff freeze back at every now and then, and don't, cry about it, because it can be very stressful. You're putting all this time and energy, and then your thing freezes, and it happens in Florida. I lived all the way down in South Florida, and we had 25 degrees down there before. And, I was a mile from the Gulf of Mexico, right on the coast, very, very warm spot. There's huge mangoes and mature jackfruits and everything, but still, every 10, 15, 20 years, you can have one of these freezes. So by planting stuff properly and kind of keeping this stuff in mind. So this idea is kind of like I'm saying, starting the shortest in the southeast, kind of working up to the north, like that, and that's kind of what you call a sun trap. So this idea is showing how you can do it with maybe annual vegetable fields in between, but you can use that same principle for anything. But if you plant really tall trees in the east or in the south, you're going to block all your sunlight, so your trees on the other side, if they're like a shorter species, are never going to have the light they need. So certain species can grow in the shade, and we'll see that. But if you have a small property, you want to maximize the amount of sunlight you have, because most species are going to do better in full sun. So heat islands, especially in urban areas, a lot of you said you're from urban areas, this is the idea that concrete, metal, and a lot of man-made structures hold heat, and they actually hold heat a lot better than natural structure just because of the way they're made. Rocks are another thing that we don't really have, it doesn't really exist in Florida. We have limestone, which doesn't hold heat great. But other rocks like granite and things like that really hold heat well. So if you do have some of that imported material here, it'd be useful too. So rocks, boulders, granite, like I said, that hold heat. The stored heat can really help those few degree temperature differences. Like when it's about to freeze, just having that tree up against a building or up against a wall or a rock pile or whatever it is, can really help you push through that little bit of a disadvantage you have. So the other thing is the urban heat island effect. Cities are almost always drier and kind of harsher conditions because you have a lot of concrete, you don't have a lot of trees. But that can also help sometimes during these freeze events. It can stay much, much warmer in Tampa than just a little bit east or just a little bit north. And St. Pete is much, much warmer, and most of Pinellas is warmer because it's on a peninsula sticking out into the Gulf. Pinellas is one of the warmest parts of the state, actually. So microclimate is an area that experiences like an average temperature variation, higher or lower than surrounding areas. So determining where those are on your property makes a huge difference. And every property has little microclimates and little niches like that. So there's a huge range. And in this part of the state, you can really play with some of the temperate species and some of the tropical species. So finding where your coldest areas are and playing with that with your species that actually like cold, and they do better with cold, like peaches and persimmons and plums and things like that. And then going where your species that like the warmth, the tropical species, figuring out where those spots are, the warmer areas, and planting your bananas and mangoes and avocados and things like that. So microclimate can be a small area of your yard, little spots in your yard, or it can be on a larger scale. But even every single area has these climate nuances. So elevation, slope, and water are all things that help a lot, and these buildings and these urban heat island effects really help. So keep all those things in mind. Typically, like I said, with elevation, which we don't really have in Florida, everything settles to the bottom. The cold always settles down, so the upper areas are always warmer. Even a few feet of elevation make a huge difference. So those lowest pockets are always going to be the coldest. There's a little bit about propagating. A lot of books and things tell you don't plant from seed. It's like, oh, it takes so long, and it's not going to be exactly like the parent type. Don't do that. It's buy a grafted tree. And definitely if you like this exact variety or you want a tree that fruits faster and guaranteed to fruit, a grafted tree or a tree from a cutting or air layer is basically a guarantee. But certain species are closer to what we call true to seed. So if you like that fruit and you plant the seed, the offspring is going to be very similar to that parent fruit. Where a lot of things are not like that because we've hybridized a lot. We've crossbred these species, so when you plant the offspring, you're not really sure what you're going to get, you can get a whole bunch of genetic variations. So certain things you can plant directly from seed. Things that we do from seed out here are jackfruit quite a bit. And jackfruit from seed are faster to grow and faster to fruit than from a grafted tree typically, which is unusual for most species. Most species fruit faster from a grafted tree. A lot of trees I found are stronger directly from seed versus cuttings. So grafting is when you take a seed and you plant that, and you actually use a rootstock, another species, another variety. For certain things like peaches and plums, it's very particular. You use what we call a nematode-resistant rootstock. Nematodes are a soil-borne organism that can kind of latch onto the roots and suck out nutrients. They're parasitic. They're pretty much a sessile organism. They just, once they're there, they're there. They don't really move around a whole lot in the soil. And certain species have these root problems, root diseases and things like that. It's not a very big problem in Florida, but especially when you get more into the temperate species, further north you go, that's really an issue. For certain things, you actually have a different variety of the rootstock versus the top. So you're splicing together a root variety to a fruiting variety. So for example, with these peaches, there's a nematode-resistant variety of peach that's just been selected by planting out a ton of peach seedlings and finding out which one doesn't get nematodes and grows better in the nematode-infested soil. After that was determined, someone started selling the seedlings and selling the rootstock. And now you get your variety of peach, let's say like UF Sun, which is a variety that was developed, quite not genetically modified, but naturally selected probably 50 years ago to fruit better in this part of the state. It's a low chill peach. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, like the chill hours. But basically, you take that rootstock and graft it onto to your fruiting variety. So you're getting the roots of this nematode-resistant peach that makes really crappy tasting peaches, but it has really strong roots. And then you're getting the fruit and the tree of your desired peach, your UF Sun. So that makes, it's really important with peaches and plums and nectarines and persimmons in Florida and certain things. But for other things, it's not as important. For most mangoes, you can plant a mango seed, and if it's growing vigorously, if it's a good grower, it's not real stunted and diseased looking, you can graft any mango onto that and it's going to do good. Like with chapotacabas, you plant a regular purple chapotacaba and graft onto that and it's fine. Most of these things are like that in Florida. It's very particular with these temperate species more, but with avocados is one thing that a lot of people love growing, and it's more particular with the rootstock. And avocados have a lot of fungal root problems here, and most of your avocados from the store, like your Haas avocados and things, those genetics are from an arid region, a cooler arid region, like Mexico or California, and they may, if you had those grafted onto the proper rootstock here, fruit better. But if you plant the seed of something like that and try to grow that out or try to graft onto that, it's not going to do nearly as good in this part of the state as if you get the Caribbean genetics of avocado and graft onto that. So with avocados, real quick, there's 3 races, kind of a little tangent, but just to go over it real quick. There's 3 races of avocados. They're not really different species, but they're called races, is what the science books call them. Basically, there's a Guatemalan race, a Mexican race, and a Caribbean race. So the ones that you see in the store sold as Florida avocados are typically Caribbean strain, or they're hybridized between Caribbean and one of the other Guatemalan or Mexican. The colder hardy varieties of avocado are typically Guatemalan varieties. They always have narrower leaves, like skinny leaves like that. And if you crush the leaf, it smells kind of like anise, like a licorice scent. So you can definitely tell there's quite a bit of genetic difference, but they're still the same species. And if you try to plant those Guatemalan or Mexican genetics from seed in a lot of parts of Florida, depending on where you are, if you're on a really high sand ridge like this, you probably get away with it. But in most of the parts of the state with the low water table, it's pretty close to the surface. The water's not that far down. Those problems are going to have, those roots are going to have fungal issues. So by planting a Caribbean variety that's adapted to more rain and humid conditions and fungal issues in the soil, and grafting onto that, you're going to have a lot better success here. So that's just a little bit of a thing about rootstock. Not everything has to be grown from rootstock. You can graft, like I said, right on to, like if you already have a big seedling mango growing, or if you have already a grafted variety of mango growing, you can graft onto that still too. So it's kind of limitless. Once you get into grafting and all that, you can put 20 varieties on one tree if you want. And there's some issues with that because sometimes one will grow faster than the other one, and this one's growing really slow, and so you got to really kind of pick and choose when you do that kind of stuff. But we don't do a ton of graft mixing and stuff like that.
Is there a limit on that as far as the maturity of the tree? Like, you know, a 10-year-old tree is kind of pushing it as far as grafting to that?
No, you can graft on any size tree as long as you find comparable budwood, compatible budwood. So if you have a branch that's this big, it's going to be hard to graft onto that because once you put that graft there, you have to find a piece of budwood that big, which isn't going to take most of the time that well. It's usually better on newer growth, on younger branches. So if you have a huge old tree that you love, like the root, it's a massive root system, you can actually, they call it top working the tree, cut it down like that. This is what they do in California, and they do it in South Florida with mango orchards. They chainsaw the tree down to a stump like that high, and then it resprouts, and they pick the strongest sprout. They cut off all the other sprouts, and they graft onto that little sprout with a new graft. And then in like 2 years, I've even seen in 1 year, the tree's already like pretty big. Because it has a huge root system, and it just pushes that graft out, and you get a massive tree in 1 year. So certain things you're not going to do that with, like peaches don't have a long life. They're usually a 10-year-old tree. A lot of species are short-lived, like guavas here too. But on a mango or an avocado or a lychee, or a lot of these old species, like a pear even, you could top work like that and then regraft. Or you could pick a branch up high and do it like a top working a little bit higher up, so you keep half of the tree one variety and the other half another variety. So yeah, that gets pretty interesting. But another thing that's very interesting is just planting seeds out, because when you have things that are true to seed, you kind of know what you're going to get, but a lot of things aren't true to seed. So a lot of things aren't true to seed, so you're going to get a lot of variation. If you plant out like a guava, for example, has like 100 seeds inside of it. If you plant out 100 guava seeds, you could get 50 different guava varieties out of that. And one of them may be really good, one of them may be not so good. You totally play with that. And certain things fruit really fast from seed, so you can actually get, you can play with that and get fruit really quick. Certain things like avocados take so long from seed, or certain varieties like sapote, like mamey sapote, takes forever from seed. So you may want to graft that. But other things that are quick, like mangoes are pretty quick from seed, guavas, jackfruit, canistel is pretty fast from seed. Those you can plant seed out if you have a little bit of space and see what you get. And you can actually get a lot of times better adapted varieties for your area, because the ones that are going to grow the strongest are kind of adapted there. When you take a grafted variety, it can't really adapt because it's just one genetic variety and it's there and doing its thing. But if you plant out 10 seedlings, the one that does the best, you keep that one going, and the other ones aren't so good. So you kind of quickly self-select.
And another quick question on that
Sure.
topic. The ones that you're saying that are not true, true from seed or grow true from seed, is that like in the natural world? It seems like everything just bears seed and it sprouts. Is it the reason of the tinkering of grafting and this and that? Is that what causes them not to be?
No, that's really down to more of a genetic issue. It's monoembryonic seeds that have one embryo, versus polyembryonic seeds. Monoembryonic seeds typically are not true to seed, and polyembryonic seeds are true to seed. So that means when you plant a seed, a lot of times they'll have multiple sprouts for one seed, and those are polyembryonic. A lot of mango varieties are polyembryonic. Most of those are like Thai origin, but most of your rounder mangoes like that are from Indian origin are monoembryonic. They only have one sprout from the seed, like one little tree comes up, and those are never really true to seed. So that gets pretty technical. We're not going to get into that right now, but that's just a little quick introduction to that. But you can definitely research that online. It's pretty interesting. It's getting into genetics pretty deep when you look into that.
Is it true with the polyembryonics that the first shoot that comes up is the one that's true to seed, and anything after that isn't?
I haven't heard
I've
that.
So as far as they're all true, all shoots?
I can't really say 100% either way, but as far as I know, they're all true to seed when they come up like that. So I haven't heard that, but it could be true. There's so many little nuances in this stuff, and until you really, sometimes they're so similar to type, like a polyembryonic seed may not be the exact thing, but it's like just off, where some of the monoembryonic ones come out like so different that you're like, what the heck, that's from the same offspring, where polyembryonic are closer to true type, I guess. That'd be the more technical thing to say. They're not, maybe if you did a genetic test, but they're not a clone of it, so they're a lot closer to it.
Yeah, so with the Florida, the the first shoot on the polygon ground was basically clone. But,
Well, it's very close to it. They'll be a little different, and that's awesome. Say things that are polyandronic, like one mango called Donalakmai is a really common Thai mango that's really popular in the marketplace. That one is polyandronic, and it does have a little bit of variation though, even though it's polyandronic, but they're so similar, and they're all really good. Some are a little better, some are a little, maybe not worse, but just different. They're very, very similar. So air layering is another technique. This is the way that you propagate lychees typically in Florida, and a few other species. There's not a lot of air layering done. You can air layer quite a few species, but it's not always the most popular. A lot of species you can do from cuttings also that you can do from air layer, and cuttings are typically preferred to air layer because it's just faster. What you can air layer here that's typically air layered are, you can air layer guavas, you can air layer Barbados cherry, you can air layer figs, mulberries, a bunch of stuff. Certain things you can air layer, but the roots aren't as strong from an air layer, so you're typically going to graft that tree or grow from seed. Like a star fruit can be air layered, it will actually root. Certain things don't root out. So I'll explain what air layering is a little better here. Certain things don't root out in the air layer, and they just can't be grown that way. And some things will root out from an air layer, and they just don't grow good in the ground, so they're not typically grown that way because the roots don't grow vigorously enough. So there's a bunch of different ways to propagate each plant, and it kind of just depends on your preference. So air layering is basically like another clonal technique, like grafting or doing a cutting. But what you're doing is you're scarring a branch while it's still attached to the tree, and you're packing like wet sphagnum moss there and wrapping that in usually a tin foil or some kind of little material to protect it. You keep it humid inside there, and then roots are going to form there. So typically you scar it. That's a really neat air layer, but I learned from a few nurserymen that you don't need to make it that neat. You can use channel locks and just grab it and like rasp up the branch. That's much faster, and it works just as good. Doing this nice little cut, there's a lot more margin for error here because if you cut too deep, you cut actually through the cambium layer. So this little layer of bark on a tree, they all have this little layer of bark. It's not really doing much for the whole life of the tree. It's protecting this cambium layer, which is the next layer, right below that thin bark layer. And that little layer, right around the inside of the tree, which is not really doing much either, it's just kind of there for support, is the whole life, like the vein system of the tree, the vascular system. And that's just this little thin ring right inside the bark that goes around the whole circumference of the tree. And that cambium layer, once it's exposed and then packed with that wet moss, it sends roots out. So once these roots are sent out, it's packed with the moss, covered up, the roots fill that little bag, and then you come back in a month or so and feel that bag, make sure the roots are filled in there. That's scary. So the roots will fill in that little bag, and then you can actually clip that off. And then usually you clip off some top growth too. Whenever you're trimming a tree, whenever you're doing cuttings or propagating a plant, whenever you're removing roots from a tree, you got to remove leaves also. It's all about a root to leaf ratio. So if you're cutting off like a branch from a tree and want to do a cutting, and you have all these leaves on it, those leaves, they transpire. They evaporate moisture away. They actually respire. They bring in oxygen and CO2 and all that kind of stuff, and then they let out moisture. Because there's no roots to provide moisture to them, those leaves actually are just giving all the moisture from that piece of a cutting, that trunk, they're just giving it away to the environment. So by removing all those leaves, you're reducing that moisture loss. So when you do that, when you do an air layer, after it's rooted out, you cut that below that bag full of roots, and you have this nice branch like that, then you're going to cut off most of the leaves, and you're going to put that usually in a pot in the nursery, and keep it kind of moist for a few weeks, and usually in about 2 months it roots out fully in your pot, and you can plant it out in the field. So we do that with figs sometimes to get bigger trees right away versus doing a small cutting and growing it out for a few months in the nursery. You can air layer a big branch of the fig, and in 3 months you have a nice sized tree to plant out like that. But that's pretty much the only way lychees are propagated in Florida is air layer. That's the only thing that's almost 100% propagated by air layer. It's just easier and it makes a good tree. So cutting certain things you can just do a cutting of and stick it in the ground. Figs are like that. You can do a green cutting of figs, mulberries, a lot of things like that. You can just cut and stick. Dragon fruit. These are mulberry cuttings. Mulberries are the best in the spring to do cuttings of. So you can do root suckers and root divisions. That's typically done through things like a lot of your perennial vegetables. But certain things, certain fruit trees are done like that. Mostly bananas. So bananas can be separated from pups. Like a lot of people know that you see a little sprout come up and you chop it off and plant the pup. But you can also dig up the whole entire root mass and then chop it into a bunch of pieces, and each one of those will sprout. So if you really want to get a lot of land, that's the best way to do it, but it's very labor intensive. I'm not going to go real far into this. Mainly, we'll talk about when we get out there. Mulch is pretty much the most important thing for growing fruit trees here in Florida. Heavily mulching, using mixed mulch from like tree trimming is the best. It has leaves and twigs and bark and branches and stuff in it. That breaks down into really, really good soil. We'll go more into that when you can actually see